Ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen and ladies, cats and dogs, children of all ages and everything in between, welcome, welcome, welcome. You know who it is. It is the kid, Unc Just, the pizza freak, resonating at the pizza frequency. I love talking about pizza. I love making pizza, but mostly I love sharing pizza with people that I give a ship about. Yes, literally, breaking bread with mother stinkers that I love. And I have a sneaking suspicion that you too, my friends, also resonate at said pizza frequency, or why else would you be here? And where is here? Here we are. Office Hours Slow Rise presents Science of Sourdough. Guys, I'm really excited. This is part 3, fermentation, a look at the world of yeast and beyond. I'm not going to hide my excitement. We have Stephanie Swane here with us of Modernist. She is the publisher. She is the editorial director. She is the sage of pizza pie. She has traveled around the world. She has eaten every single slice of pizza, every style of pizza. She is friends with every pizza maker in the whole entire world, and she is taking her sweet time and spending it with us to talk about sourdough and all these beautiful things. I'm really excited. We've been lucky enough to spend a few occasions on Zoom with Stephanie, and she's just a wealth of knowledge, a prophet of the pie, and she's gonna drop some knowledge bombs on us. So I'm really excited about this. Modernist cuisine, modernist bread, modernist pizza. So really good stuff. We've also had a chance to spend some time with Chef Francisco Magoya of Modernist. We did a Detroit style as we unwrapped the Frico crust, or we tried to disassemble and figure out how to do Frico crust. So we have had a lot of fun. This is, like I said, number 3, Science of Sourdough. Science of Sourdough will continue every other week in between our free office hours. These will live eventually on YouTube for everyone to let's fermentate YouTube so people can keep learning, keep making pizza, and in this case keep working on their sourdough. So I'm going to bring Noel on. We're going to chit chat for a few minutes. He's going to talk about what's coming up. They have a few special announcements, and then we're going to be bringing Stephanie on. We're going to go through a slideshow, and so if you are on your cellular device, we recommend flipping to the horizontal view so you can better follow along. And like I said, this is going to live hopefully soon on YouTube's. And so we can share it with our friends. And if you don't like it, you just tell your enemies, go watch this thing about sourdough, which won't happen. I kid. But thank you for joining us. Oh, today, guys, a little something different. Instead of promoting all the attendees to panelists, we're going to encourage you to ask your questions with the little Q&A button. We're going to ask you to maintain as attendees. At the end, if you have any burning questions as an attendee, go ahead and raise your hand. And if we have time permitting, we'll try to promote a few people and get a few questions in. But that's all it from me. I'm going to bring him on. I'm going to blue bell him. You know the Dillio, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Slow Rise himself, Noel, Mr. Slow Rise Pizza Brohner. Noel, come on down, brother.
Justin, can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can see you. I can hear you. I'm spotlighting you.
Oh, nice.
I'm spotlighting. I'm good. I was going to spotlight me. And a little QT before I jump off. There I am. There we are. Here we are. We find ourselves once again on Zoomies. I'm loving this. Yeah.
Sure do. How are you?
How are things going? I am well. Thank you for asking. I got this modernist background. Last time we spent a little QT with Steph, she threw up this modernist background from, so I had to screenshot it and make my background and pretend like I'm in the modernist kitchen somewhere, trying all different sorts of different styles of pizza from all across the world with all different types of fermentation schedules and mixing styles and different flavors. And it's really that thing. That's what I love about Modernist. And that's why, at the end, I always say we don't get into the politics of pepperoni and pineapple. We say pizza always and always pizza. And I think that that's what's great about the book is it just goes through all these different styles. Pizza is so subjective to so many people, and it means so many different things. And there's so many different ways to enjoy it with people that you love. And Modernists really, not only do they celebrate it, but it's an encyclopedic knowledge bomb of that. And it's also friggin' beautiful. I mean, I don't know if we can see it. It's pizza porn. The images.
All right, hold on there. Hold on there. You were doing great right up till then. Right up till then.
All right, sorry.
Right up till then. Thank you. Bluebell yourself. Thank you, sir.
So I'm going to bounce off. I'm going to let you chit chat. Thanks for bringing me along. Lead these people into sourdough nirvana, would ya?
Beautiful. Thank you. All right, you guys, super exciting. There are many of you, two-sided today. There's so many of you. So thank you all for joining us. This has been a class that I've been looking forward to for weeks. Thank you in advance to the whole Modernist crew and Stephanie and everybody that works with her, Caitlin, who I think is going to be viewing as well today. Always exciting to work with them. And I've got Modernist Bread, I've got Modernist Pizza, and these are all very exciting to me. So long story short, when I was looking for people to invite to Science of Sourdough, I happened to be looking through Modernist Bread, doing some research on sourdough, and I thought, they have a lot of really good stuff. And so I cold called via email, whatever you call that, cold emailed Stephanie and Caitlin, and of course they agreed to join us. So super excited. Thank you guys for that. So we're looking forward to about 45-minute presentation with Stephanie. So we'll bring her on shortly. In advance of that, let's do a little record keeping and paperwork. So let's see here. We do have some upcoming classes that I'm super excited about. I'm looking right now at my calendar. So let's see. 2 weeks from now, I'll be bringing Cameron on in a second. We're going to be welcoming Cameron Martino back on, our microbiologist in residence. And we have been planning to make this announcement for a while, so I'm not going to let the cat out of the proverbial bag just yet. But I'm going to announce what we're going to be doing in 2 weeks, which will be awesome. That's going to be October 9th. And then I mentioned this, I believe, last week during office hours, but here's an awesome book that I have been reading. I listened to the Audible version, and then recently I bought this book. It's called Sourdough Culture by Eric Pallant, or Eric Pallant. Pardon me, I need to learn how to pronounce his name. And so this, for me, is one of my favorite books that I've read of late. It's all about the history and culture of sourdough. And so I thought it would be a great follow-up to have Eric on. And so I messaged a few people that I know to see if anybody knew him. And it turned out that many people know him. I did not. And so I was excited when I got an introduction. Thank you, Peter Reinhardt. And so we had an interesting conversation only last week about how he could help us to teach pizza makers about sourdough. And we're still working on exactly what we're going to do, but I think we're going to do basically a modern history of sourdough, having to do really with the last 100 or even 75 years. So the book is really great. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat if anybody's curious about it. There's also a lot of great lectures online that Eric has done, and I'll put some links to those in the registration page. But basically, we're going to focus on chapter 7, which is modern bread. And for those of you who want the 6,000-year version of his history, you can either pick up the book, or you can read, or you can look at some of the YouTube videos. And there's a lot of really beautiful presentations that he's done. So the guy is like, he's a bastion of knowledge, really. And I think it's going to be a great 1-2 punch, because Stephanie's going to give us a more macro view of the world of yeast and bacteria, and hopefully Eric's going to focus on a more modern view. So I'm really excited to have all of these people coming forth, and we also have lots of other guests that we're planning on inviting, but we won't let that proverbial cat out of the bag, or the cat out of the proverbial bag yet. In the meantime, Justin, what do you say if we welcome Cameron back for just a wee moment and chat with him?
Yeah, Cam, you want to jump on, buddy? Ask you, and please unmute at the same time. I'm going to bring you down. I'm going to add spotlight, and you're unmuted. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Are you kidding me? Look at all this pizza behind me.
I'm excited to learn about the history of fermentation.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all? All right, Cameron, I know you're always an unwilling participant in these kinds of public outings, if you will. Yeah, I used to be shy like you too, my whole life, actually. And so you've come out of your shell very nicely for somebody who claims to be just a scientist. It turns out you're quite a personality too, I'm learning. So.
I got to say, I'm proud of all of you guys.
Justin, none of us will ever have your acting chops, though we can try. Thank you.
Yeah.
Justin really does have awesome chops. I've been doing this with Justin for a couple of years. He's never ceases to amaze me. So Cameron, enough about Justin. Let's chat about what we're going to do in 2 weeks. Tell me. I mean, we've been talking about this for a while, and let me just toss you a few softball questions and see if you can hit one out. How do we want to announce to people what we're planning 2 weeks from now? How do we do it? It's complicated, right?
That's a good question. You and Justin are the professionals. How should we do it?
Well, all right. So let's talk about this. One of the reasons that I've had you on here is that you are a professional microbiologist, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that I said, I think on the first week you were on the show is on the show. Yeah, it's like it's a show on the Science of Sourdough Zoom, was that at some point we're going to make an announcement and we're going to come out of the proverbial closet. There's that saying again, right? So you have a lot of interesting projects going on. You've been working as a scientist for many years, and now you've launched your own company called Levain Foods, right? So maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about, I know it's not a household name yet, but and you've got barely 300 square feet in San Diego. That is a beautiful laboratory and pizza kitchen. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, we're a small little company, but we're trying to create a product that allows us to capture all this microbial diversity we've been talking about for the last few weeks, and all those tools that the brewers have with all these different strains, right? We're trying to capture that for bakers. So the idea is that we have a product that could make a sourdough in a kind of active powdered format. So all the properties of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, baker's yeast that you're used to, but it can make different flavors, sourdough flavors, can change the way that your bread ferments with the microbes you're using. And you can know what microbes are in there. You can have some control over it. And some idea of the product that will be produced, and you won't have to backslop it or do any kind of big pre-ferment. You just drop it in, just like you do your IDY or your active dry yeast. But it will be a community of yeast and bacteria, and that's how we met, right, Noel? You came and taught me how to make pizza.
I mean, it was one of the stranger assignments. I mean, normally when I join somebody in a foreign land like San Diego, I'll go to their pizzeria or their restaurant. I've gone to people's homes sometime if their pizza or restaurant hasn't been set up yet. But I went to your laboratory, didn't I?
You did, yeah. How was that?
It was pretty awesome. I actually learned a lot. You gave me a crash course in microbiology. I wasn't expecting it, but it turns out that then, as somebody who's been making pizza and bread with sourdough for 15 years and have often been frustrated by the process, you hit me to some of the reasons why things have not turned out exactly as I had planned. So very helpful, actually.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll learn today, and and later all the other benefits of sourdough too.
Yeah. So how do we explain what we're going to do next week? I'll start by saying that I've been reaching out to some of my pizza friends around the country, and what I'm trying to do is see if I can get them to send us some of their sourdough starter, because what I would love to do in 2 weeks is capture and analyze some of their starters. Some of you have heard of some of the friends that I'm contacting. I'm not going to say quite yet, but we've all heard of lots of them. Some of them are local, some of them are on the East Coast, some of them are around in other countries, but they're all awesome artisan bread and pizza makers. But not all of them are Dan Richards or Daniele from Pizzana, although those are two of the people that I have reached out to. Some of them are teachers, some of them are farmers, some of them are millers, some of them are home artisan bakers, but all of them are extremely well known in the community. So what I would like to do with Cameron in a couple of weeks is show to the people at home and in their pizzerias and restaurants what's possible in terms of analyzing sourdough starters, and really talk to the people who have the starters and see how the data correlates to their experience of the starter. Cameron, can you help me out with that? Maybe go a little deeper on my explanation.
Yeah, we'll look at what bacteria and yeast are in their starters and some interesting facts about those bacteria and yeast, what makes their starter unique and cool. and how they contribute to the leavening and sourdough flavor that you get from their starter. And we're also, you want to do the announcement here quickly?
Yeah. Why don't you give it a try?
Yeah. So we got a lot of feedback from the last one, and people want to know what's in their starter. And here at Leaven, we're also curious and exploring starters. We want to know kind of all the different microbes found in different starters, and so we're opening up what should we call it, Noel? A survey, a selection of sourdoughs. We're going to
I would say
select
it's the beginning of a long and wonderful process where we're going to let home bakers, pizza makers in their pizzerias and restaurants submit applications to have their starters analyzed, right? And hopefully we'll select a few for next week, but the process will be ongoing because we're building a library, right? And I know we have to get Stephanie on in a second, but maybe you can come back at the end and we can talk more about the criteria. But just so everybody knows, we're going to be putting a registration page up probably as early as tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to learn a lot more about the process, and we'll get everything going then. And then obviously next week we'll do the big reveal and tell you everything that we're not able to tell you today. So, Cameron, thank you for joining us. If people do have more questions, you'll be living in the chat for the next hour or so. So you and James can answer any questions that way. Justin, how are you?
Good. Thank you, Cameron.
Welcome back.
Hey, let's do this thing. Let's bring her on. Steph, if you're there, please join us. Please. Stephanie Swane, everyone. Stephanie, let me just bring you on, adding spotlight. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see you again.
It's wonderful to see you too, Justin and Noel. How are things down in LA?
Better than ever. Thank you.
All right.
It's like a cool 72, like sun is shining, light breeze. Come on.
Perfect.
Yeah. I'm going to let you guys get to it. Enjoy. Thank you. See you in a little bit.
Stephanie, do we have the same headphones? I mean,
I think we do. Very similar.
Pretty
Great
cool,
accessory.
Right? Great. I'm not known for my accessories, but you probably are.
Whatever does the job, right?
Whatever does the job. Yes, ma'am. So let's see. What are we doing here today? Thank you also for joining us. It's always a pleasure to see you and to work with you.
Thank you, Noel. Anytime you reach out, I'm always excited to see what you have up your sleeve, and always happy to participate.
Absolutely. So we've worked together a bunch. It's always fun. I don't know if everybody knows you, so maybe if you wouldn't mind, a brief introduction would kind of be in order, starting with what's your earliest memory of pizza and how'd you get into it?
Oh, my earliest memory of pizza is my dad making pizza on Fridays. My dad would make pan pizza, which would be synonymous with grandma style pizza. And it would be in the cookie sheet pan, usually with hamburger on top. And it was the day that my mom didn't cook. And so we would gather around, have pizza as a family. A lot of times on Fridays, we'd have friends over. So it was just, how many sheet pans were we going to be having in the oven based on the amount of kids that were over at the house. So, yeah, that's my earliest memory. And then also after sports, whenever we had a swim meet on the weekends, we would go to either Shakey's or Round Table Pizza, because I grew up in California.
So where in California?
I grew up in Livermore, which is in the East Bay.
Got it. I celebrated all my earliest birthday parties at Shakey's. I'm a huge fan.
I love Shakey's. For a birthday party, it was the best because you really felt like you were like the king or queen of the birthday, with the hats and the noise and the just like over the top celebration.
Right?
Yeah, it was really, really fun.
And besides the ambiance and the service and pictures of soda, but also impossibly thin crust pizza cooked on a hearth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it was super thin. And usually like either pepperoni or sausage as a kid, or cheese, plain cheese.
That was it.
And nothing fancy, it was just like the very simple, but they really knew how to throw a party. That's what I really loved about Shakey's, is it was all about the accessories, the stuff. Like it wasn't just the pizza. They really made it feel like it was, the happiest place on earth and it wasn't Disneyland.
Now, people are already messaging me about mojos. And so, were there even mojos back in the day? I don't remember mojos, right?
There were not. No, it was really like, I don't even think they had salad.
I don't even think they had salad either. They had soda, beer, and pizza. That's it.
And pitchers. Everything was in pitchers.
Yeah.
And then the straw hats were the big thing, and you got to wear a straw hat on your birthday. And sometimes you could get everyone to get a straw hat in your party, depending on how many
not
years
in Tarzana where I went. They were no. The straw hat was for the birthday boy. And the drunk guy at the bar. That's what I remember.
And the banjo player.
And they had a player piano too.
They had the player piano. So you could pretend like you knew how to play piano, which I never learned how to play piano. So it was like you could be a star. It was amazing.
It was great. Well, it's nice to know that we have we have that in common, because that was a big part of my pizza history, right? And looking back, I would say it was probably the best pizza in the universe to me, right?
Oh yeah, at the time, totally.
Right, and it was an awesome blend of cheese and sauce and crust and sausage if you wanted it, pepperoni, right? Fun
Super
atmosphere, not expensive.
No, cheap. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why everyone had their birthday party there too.
Yeah.
And the parents could get drunk on beer.
I didn't say it. You did.
I know that's one of the reasons my parents went.
I know mine too. I think my parents were more fond of Gallo Burgundy, back in the 60s and early 70s. But, German beer, they had a pretty good selection if memory serves.
And I think they had the old school Chianti bottles too, if I remember correctly, at
I'm sure.
there. So I'm sure my mom did a little, drinking of the Chianti.
Good.
While we were celebrating.
Good for your mom. Good for my mom. Excellent. All right. Well, before we go any further down the rabbit hole that maybe nobody else is sharing with us, what are we doing here today?
We are here to talk about fermentation.
Yes.
We're going to peruse through Modernist Bread, and I've highlighted a few things that we talked about, really focusing on the history of fermentation, but also some of the really fun findings that we had while we were working on Modernist Bread over the 5-year period. So I'm going to share some of the experiments and findings that will also kind of tie back to the history side and some of those myths or things that people continue to have questions about. I'm going to bring some of those experiments to life. And
Perfect.
Of course, we'll have great photos.
Let's do it.
All right. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Is it all right if I interrupt you from time to time if I have pressing questions from the rabble rousers that are in attendance or myself?
I love it.
Good.
And yes, you can.
Thank you.
That's why I keep coming back. It's all right. Okay. So fermentation, a look at the world of yeast and beyond. And as I mentioned, it'll be really focusing on what we found in bread. This is an image that we took, which is basically what we think the early bread probably was like, something that was probably baked on hot rock because they didn't have ovens, and most likely some type of poured flatbread because they also didn't have pans at that time for shaping breads. A little bit about us. We have about 400,000 copies in print of our beautiful books. We're in 9 languages, from English to Japanese, Korean, Chinese, French, Spanish, German, Italian. A little bit about Modernist Bread. Here are some factoids. Over 1 million words, over 60,000 loaves were baked during the process, as well as 40 tons of flour. So a lot of flour during that time, and continuing a lot of flour through pizza. As I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on fermentation, which really takes us through the first 3 volumes, but there are 6 volumes. The book itself weighs about 53 pounds, so about 10 pounds per volume. And we're also in French, German, and Spanish for Modernist Bread. So one of my favorite topics, which I know after watching the last one, is which came first? The dialogue between many, many people. Was it beer or bread? And this is a relic, an Egyptian relic that was found. Was grain first domesticated because our early ancestors were fond of beer, or was it the purpose of actual sustenance? It's an amusing question, but it's also a serious and long-standing topic of debate. The issue became a hot topic in the 50s when an American, Robert Brainward, a founder of scientific archaeology, was an early proponent of radiocarbon dating archaeological sites. The symposium resulted in lots of theories, but no clear-cut answers. Over 65 years, there still hasn't been a settle on the question or consensus that it was either food, either bread or porridge, or beer, which one came first. Throughout the years of debate, there seems to be an agreement at one point our ancestors most likely discovered alcohol by accident, perhaps by stumbling across fruits that had fermented. We also know that some cultures developed a particular fondness for beer, including the ancient Sumerians, which this is from, who drank it through enormous straws. But whatever the answer as to why grain was first domesticated for bread or beer, we're glad that someone back there came up with both of these bright ideas. Pliny the Elder. The man, the myth, the beer. I right now have my wonderful Pliny the Elder from Russian River that I am going to enjoy while we talk through questions later. Much of what we know about how the ancient Romans made bread and a lot of other things came from Pliny the Elder. Pliny's greatest achievement was a publication around 77 CE of 37 books and 10 volumes, probably bigger than Modernist Bread, called Naturalis Historia, the Natural History. It was the world's first known encyclopedia and paints a remarkably detailed picture of life in classic antiquity, as well as he wrote about bread. Pliny also recorded the names and descriptions of many types of bread, which in Roman times came in a variety of shapes and sizes, with a myriad of ingredients and flavorings. He also included several methods for what we would today call sourdough. Eurysaces. One of the really amazing things about Eurysaces is that we don't know a lot about him, but he has the most fabulous tomb in Rome. This is the tomb of Marcus Aurelius Eurysaces, baker contractor he serves, which is actually inscribed on his tomb. This tomb is over 33 feet tall and sits near the Porta Maggiore in Rome and was excavated in about 1838. The frieze, which I have illustrated below, running along the top of the tomb, shows that he ran a massive bakery production. The frieze features various steps of baking operation, including the machinery that made it possible. This is the earliest known depiction of a mechanical mixer. And so it outlines a variety of stages, and you can see it all the way around the frieze. One of the things that we loved during bread was to look at a variety of paintings. And one of the reasons was to actually look at what bread looked like in a variety of countries at that time, because obviously there were no photographs. So we looked at a few key artists and studied the roundness, the shape of the bread, to also tell whether or not things were leavened some way microbially at that time, or they were still in the flatbread era. So you can see a lot of breads in this timeline from a variety of countries, all the way up to the 1400s, that look like the bread of today. Because we love to do really interesting and fun takes on things, this was actually an idea by our chef, Francisco Migoya, to reconstruct a painting that didn't exist into this beautiful kind of look at a variety of historical breads in a beautiful table setting. So something that was reminiscent of the era that in the 17th C, that we would have potentially seen a lot of these breads. And so you've got a French bread, you've got pumpkin bread, trenchers. I'm going to talk about the Panis Picentine, which is dated back to Pliny. Fritted bread. We've got an 18th century brioche, which I'll also talk about, and the Panis Moustaches. The two breads that I'm going to talk about are the Panis Picentine, sorry about that, And this is one that actually came to be from Pliny the Elder. So we replicated this recipe in a variety of ways. According to Pliny the Elder's encyclopedia that I mentioned, Natural History, this bread was a source of pride in this area near the Adriatic Sea. And one of the funny things about this was that not only were the grains soaked for 9 days, the dough was kneaded on the 10th and then put in earthenware pots. And at the end, the pots were cracked open. And that was when you knew that the bread was done. We did not crack any pots when we made this specific bread, but we did use a lot of the same steps that they used at the time. The bread was typically soaked at the end in milk or honey wine before serving. And in our photo, we drenched it with honey. The second one that I mentioned is this beautiful French brioche. So as I mentioned before, pans were not used at this point in time. And pans actually didn't hit the scene until the probably mid 18th century. This brioche dates back, at least this brioche itself dates back to at least the 17th century, probably earlier. This recipe was from Ivan Day's book, from La Cuisinière Bourgeoise, French. It calls for a sponge or levain made with flour, hot water, and ale yeast that is left to rise. Then it's mixed with flour, salt, butter, and eggs, but no sugar. So this dough is different than most brioche now, which do have sugar or sweetener within the recipe. It's baked freeform, which is also unique to a brioche of these days. And but both of these breads were actually quite delicious. Here you can see more breads throughout the ages from the 1600s to the 1700s. And here you see a bit more leavening, more rounding to the breads, which shows, that fermentation was really coming to a height. And then you have more breads in the modern era, which is, the 19th century through a variety of countries, including Egypt, into the 20th century. Sourdough in the United States continues to have an air of novelty about it. Legend has it that Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic with a canister of sourdough really took off during the era of westward expansion, especially during the California gold rush era in the late 1840s. Prospectors seeking their fortunes carried containers of starter with them, sometimes tucking them into their shirts to protect their starters against the cold. Sourdough bread was an important element of survival, allowing miners to enjoy the comforts of fresh bread, biscuits, and also pancakes instead of unleavened hardtack. San Francisco was the epicenter of the gold rush, and in the mid-1800s, bakers in the city began to make bread using sourdough starters given to them by gold miners. Infused with, as we mentioned before, Lactobacillus San Franciscus, named for San Francisco sourdough, the result was distinctively tangy and very popular. Sourdough bread experienced a boom of its own during that time. When the gold rush moved north to the Klondike in the late 19th century, the prospectors moved on and sourdough went with them. The mixture had become intertwined with the identity of the adventurous miners, so much so that when they traveled to Alaska, they took on the name of their beloved doughs. While military men were once called doughboys, these settlers were known as sourdoughs, in part because they cozied up to their starters at night to protect them from their bitter temperatures. The Aerated Bread Company, which was in the UK in the 1800s, while making bread historically required fermentation, the breads made by the Aerated Bread Company were an exception. This British curiosity is a species of aerated dough risen without yeast or chemical leaveners, but instead made with carbon dioxide gas pumped into dough under pressure. This method came in 1962, who believed that if he could get dirty hands away from the dough, the bread would be more sanitary and better for health. The English realized that fermentation produced carbonic acid for leavening. If the acid could be produced artificially and added to the dough directly, he reasoned microbial fermentation would no longer be necessary. The entire process produced finished loaves in 2 hours, which was also a significant reduction in time over traditional fermentation. ABC, which it became known as, started as a small bakery and confectionery company in London. By 1923, it expanded to 150 shops and 250 tea rooms throughout the city, making it a pioneer in the development of chain restaurants. Think of it as an early version of Starbucks cafes. Louis Pasteur, in 1857, he published a paper explaining how yeast actually works. Pasteur showed that Swane, who I'll talk about, was right. Living yeast cells are more than chemical catalysts. Pasteur aerated a yeast culture, which forced the cells to multiply and stop producing ethanol. This came to be known as the Pasteur effect. Approximately 2 years later, Pasteur connected yeast to leaven bread, and in the following year, he described the fermentation process of wine. Her experimental methods were soon adapted by yeast manufacturers to isolate and culture strains of San Francisco Severici for sale as commercial bakers and brewers yeast. Here is a diagram that was taken for the first time seeing yeast under the microscope. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, the father of microbiology, believed that the globules of yeast he saw through the lens of his microscope emerged through the combination of flour and water. He did not imagine the truth, namely that they are a form of life altogether. This is an image that we did in our own scanning electron microscope at our laboratory. So this is where you see yeast cells budding, and you can see that they have belly buttons, which are the part of the budding area, and we say they are outies. Yeast as a leavener and a guinea pig. This also is just one particle of active dry yeast under a microscope. So now we'll talk about kind of how yeast came to be for the commercial and home baker. In 1863, Fleischmann introduces compressed yeast, taking some of the guesswork out of leavened breads. Something that was once essential to bread fermentation would change. At the start of the industrial age, small corner bakers were growing their own starters, often with yeast supplied by nearby brewers. That meant that each baker's bread had its own flavor, but these starters could be temperamental. In 1868, two Hungarian-born brothers, Charles and Max Fleischmann, developed compressed yeast, which gave bakers more consistent results. And then they created active dry yeast in 1940 with a longer shelf life, and was developed really for the front lines of the Second World War. And later instant dry yeast was made for home bakers. Charles and Max Fleischmann, brothers, were born in Austria-Hungary, an area that was a hotbed of bread innovation. Viennese bakers were renowned for light and airy breads and pastries with a touch of sweetness. The Fleischmanns seized the opportunity to innovate bread making outside of their homeland, settling in the Cincinnati area in 1868. They devised a process that would mimic and improve on the Viennese leavener and began mass producing standardized compressed yeast. They developed a door-to-door distribution system for their foil-wrapped yeast packages and later transported them via rail. They also sold yeast commercially. But in 1876, the Fleischmann brothers opened a model Viennese bakery at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, exposing millions of visitors to the delight of Viennese bread and their compressed yeast. Within a few years, they were supplying not only the home market, but hundreds of commercial bakers. They also opened a string of Vienna model bakeries. It's often credited as a first for restaurant chains. And in the 1940s, it came up with another timely invention, which I mentioned, active dry yeast. I love these old yeast ads. They're so fun. So now we'll talk about yeast in general. Yeast has a variety of ways that it's used. Here are some examples of yeast as chemicals. Obviously, we talked before about yeast being found in beer and wine. And then also a variety of other things like kefir and distillery. And then we have yogurt, kimchi, and vinegar, which are fermented by bacteria. So baking with non-traditional yeast, these are some strains of yeast for beer and wine. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the species of yeast most commonly used for brewing and baking, has evolved in parallel with human civilization. As a species, SC encompasses a wide range of genetically distinct strains, each adapted to a particular growth medium, such as rice mash, beer wort, grape juice, or dough. Dozens of different strains are readily available for making beer and wine. Bakers, by contrast, don't have much choice when it comes to the strain of yeast they use. Yeast manufacturers do develop customized strains to suit the needs of their large industrial bakery customers, but for the rest of us, our choices in commercial yeast tend to be limited to the form the yeast is sold in, whether fresh, active, dry, or instant, rather than its genetic profile. We ran a series of experiments to see whether we could adapt bread recipes to perform well when made with yeast marketed for beer making. We also tried using barm from a brewery. We did find that those strains were weaker and inconsistent leaveners compared with baker's yeast. For a truly pronounced beer flavor, we recommend adding store-bought beer directly to your flour as a hydration component instead of using water and brewer's yeast. If you're looking for a more homemade approach, ask your friends or microbrewers for a beer to brew your own beer to get the barm, which is the scum that's basically on top. Yeast customized for bakers. In the 18th century, the commercial yeast business originated as a sideline of brewing, as Dutch brewers marketed pressed yeast specifically for baking. But the centuries-long relationship between bakers and brewers changed dramatically when in the late 19th century, brewers started switching from ales and stouts to lager in response to changing popular tastes. Unlike ale yeasts, lager yeast don't produce a yeast-rich scum on the surface of the wort during fermentation that can be easily skimmed off as barm. As lager styles gained momentum in the beer market, bakers had a harder time sourcing yeast from brewers. Are all yeasts equal? There's an ongoing debate as to which type of yeast is best for baking bread, active dry, instant, or fresh. The main issue doesn't seem to be about the power of the yeast, but rather an unspoken stigma that persists for each kind. Despite all differing opinions, we can assure you, yeast is yeast is yeast. We choose to use instant yeast rather than fresh yeast or active dry yeast in our recipes in Modernist Bread. In this picture, these breads are all based on the same recipe, but were leavened with different types of yeast. The doughs were all proofed for the same amount of time. You'll notice that the loaf made with the active dry yeast, which is the one on the right, is smaller, and you wonder why we say that one type of yeast isn't better than another. The fact that we proofed these all at the same amount of time is to show the potency of each type of yeast. The active dry yeast loaf would have looked similar in size to the other loaves had we proofed it longer.
Which are the other two? The one in the center and the one on the left?
The one on the left is fresh, the one in the middle is instant, and the one on the right is active.
Got it.
Does water type matter? So we also did an experiment on different types of water, including, if you see on the right, it says chlorinated, which is actually pool water. And so we looked at a variety of waters and found that as you can see, all of these different waters did help work. They somehow worked with our Levains. So we didn't find that you had to use one type of water, including the pool water, which I wouldn't highly recommend, would make the yeast and flour activate. Measuring pH, we looked at a variety of different levels of pH, and here you can see measuring from what is acidic versus alkaline, and where bread, like biscuits and baking soda, actually fall into the pH meter. I love this one. I could watch this one all day. How are bubbles born? We studied every step of the transformation that turns flour and water into bread. When you watch dough proof, as we show here, you're actually observing biotechnology in action. Weird stuff in starters. So here you can see a variety of things placed in with the water and just flour and water. Some bakers are devoted to the idea that raisins, pineapple juice, or yogurt can accelerate a levain's development. Our experiments showed it didn't save time to add fruits or similar accelerants to flour and water when starting the levain. In every case, our levain were ready to go in no less than 5 days. In general, the best bet is to begin a starter using the same food that yeast will eat over the long term. While it's true that an initial burst of sugar will enliven a levain, evidenced by increased volume, that's little more than a quick sugar fix. This initial boost isn't relevant to the levain's ability to sustain itself and produce carbon dioxide in your dough. So slow and steady gets the job done. Another controversy of long fermentation, less gluten. Within the past decade, research have discovered that certain fermentation procedures can help break down the gluten content in grain products, potentially making them tolerable for celiac patients. But in the reality, the science is still too preliminary to say for sure whether such methods reliably produce foods that celiac can tolerate. Most of the studies have been a small collection, but the more that this is studied, the better we will know more about if in fact this is a helpful and positive thing. Here I show what happens inside bread from the start of yeast activation to the fermentation process to the reach distribution, and then when you're baking, the oven spring, and finally flavor loss. So all of these take through the particle size of yeast going through the process. The origin of the word pouliche. There's no clear and accurate source for the origin of the term pouliche. Many people, including bread expert Raymond Calvel, attribute the popularity of using baker's yeast and pouliche in France to Augustin. There's no definitive evidence that pouliche came from Poland, which is another story. Bread historian Jim Chevalier first found the term used as an homonym, pouliche, fowl, in the 1893 work La Petite Industrie, which speaks of pouliche as mixes of water, flour, and yeast. In 1903, baker Noel Brohner, though Austrian himself, still used the French term referring to French pain de luxe, fancy bread. Only later did it mysteriously become pouliche. Liquid versus stiff levain. Does water content matter in your levain? Levain, French for levain, is what you get when you stir water into flour and allow the microbes naturally present in the flour and the environment do their thing. That said, not all levains are created the same. If you mix together equal parts water and flour, you'll produce a levain that is fluid. That is highly hydrated, we refer to as a liquid levain. If you add more flour to the mixture, let's say 100% flour to 100% water, the result will be a stiff levain. The results partially support the idea that levain hydration matters. We didn't see much difference in the texture or volume of the loaves baked with wetter or drier levain, but we did notice changes in the pH. The more liquid the levain, the more acidic the resulting bread. So if you like your sourdoughs good and sour, use a liquid levain. Baguettes, the modern invention. Long, thin loaves of bread have been around since at least the 19th century in France, but they were not called baguettes. We know that a proper baguette requires an application of steam, and we know that that technology to deliver steam wasn't in widespread use until around 1870. In any case, 2 world wars, which led to food shortages and lousy flour, put a damper on French baking. Industrialized baking led to further deterioration in quality. It wasn't until around 1980 that interest in old baking traditions resurged, and French millers and bakers joined together to improve the quality of French bread. It didn't hurt that they put some marketing muscle behind the effort as well. In 1993, a law was passed that created an official designation and rules for pain de tradition française. These loaves had to be hand-formed, be baked on the premises, and contain only 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and leavening. These laws evolved into the rules developed by the Centre National des Ressources Textuelles et Lexicales that describe the length, weight, and diameter of a true baguette. The Tassaharas Bread Book, published in 1970. This little book with illustrations of sandals and Buddhas proved widely popular, selling over 750,000 copies. Though it's considered among the most influential cookbook ever published, the bread recipes aren't all that special by today's standard, but at the time, they were a breath of fresh air. In the 60s and early 70s, many home bakers were turning out dry, dense, brick-like loaves that were packed with whole grains, often with nuts or seeds. The results were notoriously more nutritious than they were delicious. But Tassaharas bread wasn't just perceived as edible. The book made it seem spiritual, political, and even magical. The book was a perfect fit for the times, according to the New York Times magazine in 2003. One fan wrote that learning to make his own bread had liberated him from corporate America. As if those Zen students rediscover what bread bakers of old understood, bread is alive. It's teeming with yeast, a living, changing thing. That recognition alone is a giant leap away from industrial bread, but it would have taken another few decades for the landscape to really change. Along the way came other changes in public taste that would have a profound effect on bread. Ciabatta, another origin story that is of the recent. Ciabatta was trademarked in 1982, the same year the first issue of US Today was published, and the CD player was introduced in Japan. 2 Italian men claim credit for developing this iconic Italian bread: a miller named Arnaldo Cavalieri and a baker named Francesco Favaron, both deceased as of today. Today, different sources give more credit to one man or another, and the matter continues to be the subject of controversy. As best as we can understand, Favaron and Cavalieri collaborated to develop a new kind of bread that would compete with the bread coming in from its neighbor from the Northwest, the French baguette. At this time, Italy didn't have a national bread, I should say. It had many, many regional breads. According to Favaron and his family, he started experimenting with very high hydration doughs as a young baker in Verona in the 60s. These experiments were the basis for what would become ciabatta. His family says the original ciabatta recipe with 4 variations was included in a manual for his cooking school. Ed Wood, not the filmographer, a forensics pathologist named Ed Wood played an unlikely role in the investigation of ancient yeast cultures. In 1983, Wood took a position as chair of pathology at a Saudi Arabian hospital and studied he and his wife had the opportunity to collect and study sourdough cultures from bakeries that had never used commercial yeast. They traveled and acquired these wild cultures from all over the Middle East and Europe. Returning to the US, they brought 10 unique sourdough cultures with them, and in 1989, Wood wrote his first book about these cultures, World Sourdoughs from Antiquity. The book was intended for both novice and expert bakers, and it explained not only the history of sourdough baking, but also how to grow and maintain a starter. When Wood subsequently retired from pathology, he and Jean developed a method of drying sourdough cultures that would not impair their visibility, and then began to sell those 10 cultures, including the ones they had collected in the Middle East, by mail under the name Sourdough International. Raymond Calvel, Le Goût du Pain, which is the book from 1990. Calvel's ideas were first introduced to an American audience by Julia Child in the 2nd volume of Mastering the Art of French Cooking. In 1967, Julia Child attended a one-day workshop with Calvel in Paris and changed her entire understanding of French bread making techniques. Previously, she had been adding some flour to the risen dough to make it easier to handle. But Calvel explained that for finished bread to have a proper consistency, the dough had to be sticky. He also showed Julia that dough should rise in a cool place to ensure slow fermentation, better flavor, and more moisture retention. Thanks to Calvel, Child learned to produce French bread that met her exact standards. In 1990, Calvel published Le Goût de Pain, a collection of his writings on bread baking techniques. Soon after it was published, two bakers, James McGuire from Montreal and Ronald Wirtz, the director of the library at Manhattan, Kansas Baking School, set about to create an English translation. It took about a decade, and in 2001, they published The Taste of Bread. As I've mentioned before in my talk, we've talked about Alice Waters and Chez Panis. Chez Panis was the home for Steve Sullivan, who started making bread at Chez Panis based off of the first book that I have here, Elizabeth David's English Bread and Yeast Cookery. That was a book that Steve found very worthwhile in his early bread making days at Panis, and then left to create Acme Bread with his wife in Berkeley. There's a great poster from Acme Bread. And then also Dan and Sharon Burns-Leader created Bread Alone about the same time, where they developed a wonderful book on bread lessons that they had learned outside of the US, and especially organics, which is what they are still known for, Bread Alone bakeries on the East Coast. In 1992, originally developed by Eric Kaiser and Patrick Castagna in the Fermento Levain, ensures that Levain culture has a consistent balance of microorganisms by following it at a specific temperature and level of humidity. This allows the baker to produce doughs with the same leavening power and flavor throughout the production process. The Bread Bakers Guild was then formed in 1993, and Tom McMahon was one of the key originators for the Bread Bakers Guild, which was really their first foray in not only academics, but also joining many bakers in the US together to create recipes as well as scholarly works. The long history of no-knead bread. In 2006, the New York Times writer Mark Bittman published a widely popular article called The Secrets of Great Bread, Let Time Do the Work. It focused on a bread recipe developed by Jim Leahy of Sullivan Street Bakery in New York that didn't require kneading, and it became the most popular recipe the Times had ever published. An accompanying video also received over 2.5 million hits at the time. In 1999, we noticed that there was another book on no need to knead by Suzanne Dunaway, which was also a James Beard Award winner. And then we did more searching. We found several Second World War era examples. The French bread recipe, first published in 1943 edition of The Joy of Cooking, for example, also instructs no knead. There's also a 1945 pamphlet from Pillsbury called Bake the No-Knead Way. This was among the inspiration for Jeff Hertzberg, who began experimenting with no-knead ideas in the 80s. And in 2007, he and pastry chef Zoe Francis published Artisan Bread in 5 Minutes a Day, along with several follow-ups. These books simplify the no-knead concept further for the home baker, with instructions for making large batches of dough and storing them in the refrigerator for weeks. This way, daily portions can be prepped for baking in minutes. And I know Kenji Alt Lopez just recently did a take on his no-knead as well in the New York Times. At the same time, while we were focusing here in the States with the Bread Bakers Guild, the Real Bread campaign began in Great Britain, promoting bread made with no additives. And they also have a wonderful Sourdough September that they launched a few years ago. The Prados Sourdough Library, I had the opportunity to go and visit them in St. Vith, Belgium, where starters are kept in segregated environments and fed according to the baker's specification. It houses over 84 different sourdough cultures from 13 countries, and I'm pretty sure that's probably gone up since we wrote about them. But the bakers who own Levain send 25 kilos of flour to the library every year to feed and maintain the balance of the organisms in each culture. And here is ours, number 44, Levain James is our culture that we gave them during the creation of Modernist Bread. So just two little perks at the end before we go on to questions. If there are any educators on the program right now, we do have an amazing book donation program. We're all about lending our research and help to libraries. And so if there are anyone that's interested, please feel free to reach out to donations. And we're happy to help any charitable organizations, schools, or libraries. And then lastly, all of the attendees today, we are offering a 15% off discount for anyone that wants to order Modernist Bread or Modernist Pizza. You basically go into our shop, modernistcuisineshop.com, and enter the code, and the 15% off should come right off. So it's just a thank you for attending this wonderful talk with Noel and myself and our other guests. And if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them on in.
That was awesome.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing there.
I mean, my head is spinning. I made notes. I was chatting with people in the chat. I was talking with our guys in the back, Cameron and James. So thank you. We don't have a ton of time. So there was one particular question that I thought was interesting. Cameron, if you have a minute and want to beam on with us, I thought that maybe we could address that one question. It had to do with
I need to sip some beer.
Sip some beer, using fruit in the Levain and Peter Reinhardt. So Cameron, if you're there and you wanna come on with us, I thought that if you wouldn't mind reading the question first and then in giving your answer, I thought it was a great question, and I'm a big fan of Peter, so whatever he says is gospel to me, but also whatever you say is the new gospel, the New Testament, if you will.
Peter's in a question in?
He's not. He's near. But somebody asked a very interesting question who had read one of Peter's books about sourdough. Okay. So Cameron, if you wouldn't mind reading that for us.
For sure. First of all, very awesome presentation, Stephanie. I learned a lot. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron.
Okay, so Jeffrey asked, Reinhardt indicates that juice is to create the proper pH to encourage starter development rather than sugar. Any indication there? So sugar is an acidifying reaction. So if you add sugar, you're inherently going to reduce the pH of whatever you're fermenting. So the two are linked. You can also bias the community that develops by adding different adjuncts like honey or juice. So I linked to a piece of literature here, but it's a small N, which means that there's not a lot of samples. But it's a nice paper where they compared a sourdough starter from initialization. So they started just flour and water as a control, and then they also added some different adjuncts, forget exactly what, but basically what they found is that when they added those adjuncts, the lactic acid bacteria were more dominant more quickly, and the starter reached a lower diversity of microbes, which indicates it's more mature more quickly. And there was also some different strains that showed up between the different adjuncts that were added. So a little N, but it's something that is super interesting. A lot of people are studying. There's lots of microbes that hang out on the outside of these fruits. But I think the environment itself selects for microbes more strongly than anything, right? Super acidic environment. Not a lot of microbes that's why fermentation works so well.
Exactly.
I love it. Thank you. We'll definitely put that link in the chat, and we'll put it in the description for people who are watching this on YouTube. I have a few questions myself, Stephanie, and they're not necessarily questions, but I think they're kind of food for further thought. So I made notes. I've got 2 pages of notes. There was so many things.
Wow, that's exciting for me.
I want to go back and look at this stuff. You were moving fast, and I wasn't sure. I knew you would come in under on schedule, so I knew that it wouldn't be much time. But a couple of things. So slide number 38. where you were talking about liquid versus stiff Levain, and your findings were that the liquid Levain ended up being a little more acidic. That's a very interesting point, because that has been a point of view, but I noticed that some pizza and bread makers have the opposite point of view. And when I brought this up with Cameron when we first met, he said there are studies that show that depending on what yeast and bacteria are in your sourdough, you could have opposite results. So a stiff starter could have the opposite result from a liquid Levain, depending on what's in your sourdough, which I think is just mind-blowing. And one of the reasons that I'm so into this project that we're doing, because how in almost every case, if two good bakers discuss the same thing, they'll have the same results. But when it comes to sourdough, sometimes they have opposite results, which is just like mind-bending for me. So I thought I would bring that up to you to let you know that there's still
it's a living organism.
Yeah,
it's a living organism, so you have a lot more of variations to play with.
Yeah. I also thought slide number 28 was really, really, really interesting, where you had the active dry, sorry, the fresh on the left, and the center was instant dry, and the right was active dry. And you'd kind of see the one in the center had, I mean, the one on the left was also very nice, and the one on the right was a little bit lower in terms of oven spring. But that's always been my personal. I never did a side by side quite like Modernist does, but I've always gone for instant dry, especially that it's really hard to find fresh yeast here.
Yes.
But I'm glad to see that you guys put that one to the test.
And fresh yeast, during our travels and talking to a variety of bakers, it's very popular in Scandinavia. I found even more so, like Copenhagen, Sweden, Norway. All of the bakers there were, when we talked about different kinds of yeast, they're like, well, we use fresh yeast. Like they didn't even have a question. It was like, you use it. That's all you use. So that was also really interesting just to see when we travel who used what and why. And it was usually like straight on, like one area liked a specific type.
Absolutely. I find that with, New York pizza makers, old school on the East Coast, they use active dry, and Italians on the East Coast use fresh. I mean, there's no ifs, buts, or ands about it. That's what you use if you want to make, Neapolitan or New York pizza, period. This is a minor point. I'm just curious. You said Fleischmann, and I say Fleischmann. Is it Fleischmann after all these years?
I thought it was Fleischmann.
I mean, it's Fleish. I don't know anything. I
don't
thought
know. I'll have to look for
Swane with an E was Swane. Ezo was Ezo with an E, right? So anyway, I just want to know, because I don't want to be mispronouncing it. And if I am, I've mispronounced it about 100,000 times.
That's what I know, but I could be wrong.
I'm going to defer to you. I'm
a Californian, so I would think we would have about the same dialect.
I don't know. I say Fleischmann, you say Fleischmann. It's all good. We all know what we're talking about.
We know what we're talking about. We know the spelling's the same.
Yes. So anyway, this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like we could take any of those slides and spend an hour on almost any of them.
It was really hard to pull it together and make sure that I fit your slot, because I wanted to go through so many things, but I had to
You did a great
job. Pull it in.
You did a great job. When I was first looking through Modernist Bread, I was wondering if you would be able to pull it off. And of course I knew that you would, but there's so many rabbit holes to go down, right?
Was this a challenge? You were like,
no. I knew.
Do it.
Look, these are all just jumping off. These are all jumping off points. That's really all they are. We want to expose people to as much as we can. And I think we definitely accomplished that. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. I had a great time, and it's always wonderful to be able to talk about all the time that we spend on Modernist Bread and the findings. And it's always also, just as we talk about these myths or commonalities between fermentation, especially, I think the more papers, the more research that's done, the more development, the bigger scale. I mean, I think that's the biggest problem with most of the research these days with along fermentation. More universities are studying it, but they really need to study it for bread specifically.
Beautiful. Justin, anything else from your end?
No, we just had, excuse me, an anonymous attendee say it's Fleischmann. I live near the town near it's named after.
Fleischmann.
Fleischmann's. A few things. Stephanie, obviously, thank you so much for spending your time with us. You're a wealth of information and knowledge, and it's really wonderful to get a chance to spend some time with you and everything that you guys do over at Modernist. So thank you very much. I did want to give you a second. Of course. I wanted to give you a second. I put in the chat that you are doing something Wednesday with Psychic Pie in Sebastopol with the Women in Pizza on Instagram Live. I put the
sourdough.
Oh, great. Sourdough
Italio.
Oh, gosh, I'm going to try to be there. I put the link into the chat for everyone. Also, I did put the link that Cameron had mentioned in the chat as well as the Q&A. So, Noel, you want to say thank yous, and then I'll take us home?
I mean, I'm so very thankful that so many people showed up for this. It's been a long time coming. There's a lot of planning and a lot of back and forth that goes into it. So appreciate you guys taking your valuable time on a Monday to chat with us and learn more about the science of sourdough. So I'm excited about this series. I'm excited that Stephanie took time, and Caitlin as well.
I'm taking a picture of us.
There you go. To Caitlin for all her help, and you it's not just you. You're the front girl in a very large and organized.
Yeah, Caitlin, thank you so much for making my job seem so much better in the presentations. And then also Rosebud and Maggie, who are my gurus in design and in editorial. They do so many wonderful things behind the scenes to make this seem like I'm doing a great job, but it's really them.
Exactly. Beautiful. So thank you, Stephanie. Thank you to Cameron and James. Justin, thank you to you, and I'll let you take us out.
Yeah, thanks, Cam and Jimmy on the back end. Steph, thank you so much. Noel, as always, leading us through this, all the variables in the pizza equation. I know my secret now in my pizza dough will be chlorine water. Keep it zipped, everybody, because that seemed to blow that up. All right, guys, you know the deal. Here at Slow Rise, we don't get into the politics of pepperoni and pineapple. Forever and ever, we say pizza always. And always pizza. Thank you, everybody. Pieces and slices with love. Thanks, Noel.
Thank you, Justin. Good job.